Well, thanks for joining us for just a couple more minutes and taking a look at the text that we saw on Sunday from Romans chapter 1. So, this is a good part in Romans, a challenging part in Romans, because, as I said on Sunday, Paul's trying to convince this church there in Rome, which is predominantly Gentiles, now that not just the people outside of the church, that need Christ. They don't have righteousness. That was our text on Sunday. This week he's going to say, you who are in the church, you don't have your own righteousness. You need Christ too. And then he's going to move on to the Jew and say, listen, you have the law of God and you still don't have righteousness. So it's one of those texts where you just got to keep moving along. Otherwise you'll focus a little too much on any one group and not get to where he's going. So the one thing about he was saying on Sunday was in verse 28, this is a scenario where God's looking at you and saying, you're looking at God saying, hey, I want to do this. And God's saying, okay, fine, do it. I'm going to live my life like this. I'm going to do this with my body. I'm going to do this with what I have, with what I want to do. I'm, in a sense, my own God, or I worship a different God. And God's looking at them and saying, okay, you have it your way. I give you over. And there's a really cool word in verse 28 of chapter 1. I would have spent just a few more minutes on had I had 5 more minutes. Because when you contrast what's going on inside of these folks' mind that he speaks to, I gave them over to a debased mind. That word's fun to chase down just a little bit. And then contrast what happens to your mind when you become a believer in Jesus Christ. So he says in Romans that he gave them over to a debased mind to do things that ought not to be done. That word debased, I mean, we don't use that word for sure very much in our language. It means, what it means is a mind that's not qualified to approve of what's right or wrong. Meaning you have a scale in your mind and God says, okay, fine, you want to use your scale? Use your scale. But your scale's disqualified. I mean, God says this is 5 pounds. You put it on your scale and you say it's 3 ounces. God says this is 5 pounds. You put it on your scale and he says, oh wow, it come up as 10 pounds. You're disqualified. Your mind is no longer able to test and approve what's right. And so now, contrast that with when you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Now you have His Spirit. He gives you of Himself. He comes to live in you, and now your mind is affected. How you interact and engage when you test and approve. Now he's trying to make this point to the church at Corinth, and again a very Gentile kind of a environment, and so he's making the point to them as well. Listen to this passage because he explains exactly what happens now with Christ. This comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14. He says, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person, in contrast, judges the things. He judges things, but he himself is not judged by anyone. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ, right? You are able to discern things now that when Christ lives in you, when His Spirit lives in you, that before it just seemed foolishness or seemed like folly or seemed because your mind was not able to, it was in that sense, as the Greek word would imply, disqualified. It was not able to test and approve what is right. When Christ is in you, now He gives you of Himself. You can test and approve what is good according to the one who says what is good, and that's Him. So you're no longer just left with your own mind, which by itself is darkened, but now you have His mind. But who can discern these things? And then he says, but we have the mind of Christ. And wow, that's what a difference. That's a thing to focus on, to look at the difference between a mind without Christ and a mind with Christ. Think about that and understand what grace does for you and how He comes to help you as you approve and test of those things which are good.